Okay, we have a little deviation from the program to talk about a new thing that we're working on at UM St. Louis on behalf of the whole UM system. It's a new corporate funding portal, and the two leads in my team that have been working on it are Tamara Wilgers and Jay DeLong, and I'm going to let them make the presentation and tell you more about what we've been doing.
Hello everyone, thanks for letting us come share this project with you. We're very excited to present this, and I'm Tamara Wilgers. I'm the Director of Technology Transfer here at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and part of this project as well as Jay DeLong. So this is an exciting, huge collaborative project. It's not only the University of Missouri system, but it's also the SIU system. So what we're trying to do is build a tool that will hopefully help researchers access industry-sponsored research and also industry contracting very easily, and also build those relationships a little bit. But first I wanted to throw out a huge thank you to all of the chief research officers at the 4 universities within the system, and also the tech transfer offices at the 4 campuses who have been very supportive. And Mark McIntosh, who I think might be still be here. So he helped kickstart this whole project when we started talking about this a couple years ago, and provided some financial support from the system. So we're very appreciative. So real quickly, I'm going to just give a kind of a background of this, and then let Jay kind of walk you through how this will work, what it is. But I kind of want to talk about how this is going to be important for our researchers. So with federal funding becoming more competitive, and industry-sponsored research becomes more and more important, as I'm sure you all know. But industry perceptions of working with universities are not always that positive. There have been some barriers and maybe some bad experiences. So we're hoping with some tools that we're providing on this portal that we can smooth out those obstacles and reduce the barriers. So what we're doing is providing an online portal that will provide curated matches between industry research needs and university expertise. So kind of the background is SIU actually approached us to see if we wanted to partner with them. It was in 2017. They were inspired by a portal that Penn State University had developed internally, and they've seen a lot of success with it. Theirs is just internal to their one university, but they've seen industry-sponsored research go up. The average project through their portal is about $100,000. So, and they've actually developed some new industry partnerships. One of the best things that they've seen, though, is increased engagement from researchers at their university who don't necessarily usually engage with industry. They're starting to engage with industry. So I think that's a really interesting outcome for them. So we did some due diligence with the university folks and also industry partners. We have 4 founding industry partners, and they're large companies, but we want to expand that to include a lot of startup companies and mid-sized companies. But our 4 founding partners, I'll talk about a little bit later with our partners. But we went looking for funding. We couldn't do this all on our own, so we did apply for an Economic Development Administration I-6 Challenge Award, which we got last fall. We're very excited about that. So we have about $700,000 from the federal government, and that was a 1-to-1 match. So between the 2 university systems and our partners, we were able to match that. So it's a $1.4 million budget for this project. So our goals are really to just streamline the access for industry to get to our researchers and find the right people to work with. So that could be a research challenge that they have immediately. It could be a startup company looking for a partner to pursue federal funding. It could be someone looking for equipment or facilities and needing to contract use of those facilities. So we're just trying to make this as quick and easy as possible, online, one-stop shop kind of thing for industry. And for the University of Missouri faculty, we of course need faculty profiles, and we're very happy to say that for our campuses, that your profiles will be pretty much pre-populated. So we're very excited about that. You won't have to do a lot of work on those. The other thing though too, we're trying to facilitate student internships through this project. So our industry partners will have them identify a student champion for any project that they fund. So you have a research team that a lot of times will include students. So this champion will help them kind of navigate through the company, and there might be the possibility of jobs in the future or even internships at the end of the projects. And of course, we want to build those strong industry academia relationships. So real quickly, our partners are, of course, the full system of the University of Missouri, SIU system, and then our industry partners to date are Bayer Crop Sciences, Mallinckrodt Pharmaceuticals, Millipore Sigma, and EDEC Motor Corporation. Our target industries under the grant are IT and advanced manufacturing and biosciences, so kind of the usual suspects. But this is going to be open for all disciplines. We think that there's a lot of benefit for every discipline at all the campuses. We also have several organizational partners under the grants, and then supporters as well who helped us with the grant application. So where we are right now, we have a couple of challenges. We're working in this first year of the 3-year grant to do the development of the portal, and we're about to do a soft launch where we need our faculty to opt in, because you won't get any of these challenges or opportunities if you don't opt in and claim your profile. So hopefully in the next few days, up to a week, you'll get a notice from your campus with a link, researchenabled.org. And you can go in and claim your profile and make sure that all the information is correct. And so we really want all of our faculty to engage in this, because it's not really going to be of benefit to anybody if our faculty aren't involved. So in 2020, one of our major focuses will be to grow the industry pool of partners and make sure that our faculty are engaging. And then we're looking at sustainability of the project, of course, after the grant period ends. So we are very excited about this, and we really hope that everyone here will help us by opting in and claiming your profile when you do get that message, and then get ready to respond to these challenges next year. We're looking at launching February, March of 2020. So it'll be a really easy process to do a proposal, hopefully just a one-page, non-confidential, online, shoot your ideas over, and that'll start the conversation with the industry sponsors. So with that brief overview, I'm going to turn it over to Jay DeLong, who's the director of this project. We hired him in April, and he's been doing a fantastic job, and he will tell you more about the details of how the portal works.
I'm here to bore you about the details of the project. Thank you. Tamara did a nice job of thanking all the Chief Research Administration folks on the campuses, but I'd like to thank Tamara. I'd like to thank Chris, because they have brought this great idea all the way to the forefront here. So I'm writing on the back of the context and the genius of this idea, and I hope you like what they're intending to do for the research community. As Tamara mentioned, I was just brought on not too long ago, and it's my first EDU email in over 20 years. I'm very excited about that, but particularly today, after hearing the pitches, or the presentations, and this afternoon, I'm just glad to be among you. I'm very proud that I have that EDU email address. So one of the first things we did was try to understand some of the barriers, both from the perspective of the research community as well as industry. So we did some surveying. I'm not going to get in too deep into the surveys, but needless to say, my campus has underutilized research capacity. Pretty much everybody agreed with that. Nobody said false, that we don't need any more research dollars on our campus. And it's variable as to we need a lot, or we can expand in strategic areas, but everybody said, yes, we need some help in this area. We talked about what the challenges were from the perspective of university administrators, and 90% believe that the business community is unaware of the research capacity that's being offered. Okay, so that strikes most administrators as the chief issue. Whereas industry perceives university research costs as prohibitive, is 60%, and IP ownership is 50% recognized as an issue. Now, when we asked, when we asked industry, roughly the same structured questions so that we could get their perception of the same challenges, industry answered a little differently, not surprisingly. IP ownership, licensing issues, was the chief obstacle to 80% of those polled, right? And industry isn't aware of university research capacity is high up there, but it's kind of flipped from what administrators perceive, right? So we've got sort of two sets of issues that we want to address. Industry perceives university research costs as prohibitive, much lower perceived obstacle to industry than it is by us in research. So that's good information, I think. So we're taking forward these perceptions, and we're going to try to create a program that improves both the areas of sort of the addressing, or at least providing a path, a navigational path for industry. We can't resolve all the IP issues that come up, but at least what we can do is condense the time in which these issues are brought to the surface and addressed and resolved by compressing that time frame, by creating a platform that has better communication and tools for resolving those issues, and then also working to identify what capacities specifically address and solve industry problems, right? So that's the intent of our, as Tamara mentioned, that's the intent of our program. So it's a portal. This is a kind of a dense slide, so I'm going to take a minute here and explain the functionality of the way we're going to do this is there's three functional areas on the site. One is a place where industry can go and in their language identify what their business challenge is, right? They'll also explain what, if they have money, right, which I think is very important when you're going to determine whether or not you have time to propose something to industry, you need to know if they're prepared to pay and when, right? So that's a question. We try to give you as much insight about the company's problem as possible so that you can best address that challenge. When a challenge is proposed by industry, we kind of check the boxes, make sure they filled everything in completely, but they determine who it goes out to. And so when you enroll in this, you're going to determine what type of proposals or challenges from industry that you want to see. You'll get those to your inbox if that's how you prefer, and then you can propose if you're interested. Then we have a bunch of tools to help you propose as easily as possible, as quickly as possible. Then they're going to go straight to industry. And I'll get to the detail on that in just a second. The second function we have on the site, which is really important, is that industry, if it's not a research-oriented sort of a discovery type research challenge, but rather it's just some resources and expertise. They've got more of a tactical challenge. They've got to produce some reactants or some service-oriented activity, then they can do that on this portal as well. And when they put forth those kinds of requests, we're going to curate those requests, and we're going to act as sort of a concierge and work with every campus to find out what labs exist that can do this, and we're going to call those lab operators in the first year, and we're going to see if that lab's available, and if all this works out, they're going to ask that lab manager then to propose to the industry request. It's going to be very curated the first year, really sort of get the juices flowing. The third thing on this portal, which is very important, is there is a capacity for investigators to put forward their research, the investigator-initiated projects, And you'll say sort of what you're trying to achieve, put forward an abstract and what you're trying to achieve and by when and your methodology and what kind of team you're trying to build and what kind of resources you need. So this is intended to elicit interest from sponsors, corporate industry partners, but also collaborators from other institutions, other research institutions. They will be able to find this investigator-initiated project if you choose. You get to set the settings on how visible this would be to the community, to the public. Okay, so for industry, it gives them a chance to do these research challenges, request expertise and resources, and when you respond, and we aggregate those responses and give that to them, they can request more information from you, they can provide you direct feedback, they can request that you revise what you sent to them, make a little tweak or so, and then they can select the final proposal from among those that they received, and they can move straight to contract, or draft contract anyway, on this portal. So it's going to compress the time frame in which industry can say, hey, we've got a problem, get it out to everybody, everybody gets to respond, and quickly move that whole process to draft contract as quickly as possible. And as I mentioned, it also gives them the capacity to search investigator-initiated projects that you propose. Okay, for the university, it brings new industry sponsors to bear, we hope. Propose new directions in research that these industries would put forward for you to explore. They can find your projects. They can quickly match up with resources across not only the University of Missouri system and all the campuses and departments and labs and programs, but also, as she mentioned, Southern Illinois University, and we hope over time to include other research institutions to our pool of researchers, making it more valuable for industry to come to us. Okay, in the industry research challenge area, this is really the backbone. When they say we have a problem, they're going to put out the abstract, the purpose of the project. I hope you guys can see this okay. This will be available to you in more detail later. The deadline, the proposal type, the budget funding, do they have the capital? Do they want to go together with you to go out and get capital, etc.? This will all be made available. And then they propose that challenge to us. It comes to us within 48 hours. We're going to make sure that everything is checked. If not, we're going to recirculate it back to them and say, hey, you weren't clear in this area, or we're not sure exactly where you want this to go to. We'll try to get everything correct for the challenge to make sense to you, and then we'll put that challenge out, and then we'll approve it and distribute it to each campus administrative office. They're going to have complete visibility into this, but also directly to the researchers. The researchers who have selected to see these kinds of things will receive them. They'll have an opportunity then to respond. We'll quickly gather those responses, verify it has all the information industry is requesting, and at the due date that they have asked us to put on it, we'll return all these things to them. Sometimes there'll be an open-ended research process. Maybe they'll keep it open for a year, or maybe it's something they need done in the next 3 weeks. They'll set that determination, and we'll follow their needs. Then they'll have all these proposals from all these researchers, and as I mentioned, they can ask you more information. Could you please attach some research you've done in a similar area, or perhaps they've got some feedback for you, etc. The idea here is that we're going to make it as quick as possible for you and the industry, sponsors of your research, to sort of have dialogue, discuss this process, and get it to contract, right? So maybe what turns out is there is discovery and there's IP and the relationship is intractable and they're not going to choose to go this route externally and they're going to keep it internally, but you will all know sooner if a project, if research can be funded, if a deal can be consummated more quickly. And we think this is one of the most appealing things to industry, is that they'll be able to communicate with you quickly and resolve this and bring it to a contract. It's our first step. We're Going to be launching this. The soft launch is really going to be over the next couple of weeks. We're going to be reaching out to representatives at each campus to develop a strategy most appropriate for the researchers on their campus to come to the portal, sign up, answer your questions. We start posting industry challenges with some of our friends in industry in December, and then the entire public launch is in the first quarter of next year. Okay. Tamara, if you'd like to join, do you have any questions for us? We'd be glad to answer them. I hope, please, maybe use the microphone so
What's the overhead rate? Maybe this is one of the reasons that they're not so concerned about working with universities. They don't know the overhead rate.
That's going to be up to each campus, but it'll probably be our standard federally negotiated rate.
So no cut rate for them?
No.
So they're willing to pay 50%?
Most of the, well, at least the founding partners that we questioned, they didn't think that was a big deal. Internally, they pay 200% sometimes. Just to I mean, we've got to get on with the program, but Jay and Tamara will be around if you want to pull them aside and ask them questions. Feel free to do so. We're going to be rolling this out, as Jay said, over the next few months. The first thing we need to do is get faculty to opt in. Part of the opt-in is so you don't get spammed with emails. So if you don't opt in, you won't get presented with challenges and you won't be able to apply to them. You won't get the funding. So it's really up to you to become part of this program. Once you're in it, then we'll work with you to get you those challenges.
And can I just say, because it's a captive audience, that we're doing this all behind your SSO, so it's no new passwords. It'll be very easy. Active Analytics is going to populate most of the data required for your profile. You're just going to sort of check and make sure it's all accurate, right? And it goes into our database. And you'll be able to set, as Chris mentioned, you'll be able to set those communication preferences so that maybe you don't get any emails. It's just when you have time, you can go to the portal and see which proposals are appropriate to you. It'll all be determined on your preferences.
Okay, thanks. Before we move on with the afternoon session, is Nicole here? Can you stand up? I just want to give Nicole credit because when we were trying to decide on a subject for this summit, I asked the faculty to propose ideas, and Nicole Vanderhyde was the one who proposed this particular concept for the summit. So I'd like to give her credit for that. And we just make them happen. We don't come up with the brilliant ideas. Okay, so we got 2 more sessions this afternoon. The first speaker is Patty Parker from the Department of Biology at UMSL. And there you go.
Thank you, Chris. I'm Patty Parker from the Department of Biology here at UMSL, and I am going to talk about protecting biodiversity by building human capacity. Let's see, this is how I go forward. I just want to make the point that the biodiversity loss is real. There are estimates today that we're losing 1 vertebrate species per day, and I've shown you here 3 of the kind of iconic African big mammals that you are probably aware are in big trouble. And my best bet is that we will see the extinction of 1 or more of these within our lifetimes. And there have been species of rhinos whose extinctions in the wild were announced just last year. So there are also more species that are yet undescribed, and habitat loss is progressing at such a pace that scientists are scrambling to discover, identify, and name new species before they go extinct. So things are being lost faster than we can name them. There have been in the history of the Earth 5 mega extinction events, where as many as 95% of the life on Earth was lost. And then the survivors repopulate the planet, and things are different going forward until the next big extinction event. And many people would argue that we're in one now. We're in the 6th big extinction event right now. It's different than the others in that it's caused by a single species, which is us, and we're calling that the inhabitants. This is a human-caused mega extinction event. So I want to talk about, since humans are the problem, and I want to quote my colleague Chris Spilling just over lunch, saying, the problem is there are too many of us and we use too much stuff, although he didn't say stuff. What I want to do is to argue that even though humans are the problem, we need to build human capabilities and capacities to help them solve the problem. And if they are responsible, they need to know they are responsible, and they need to have the skills that it takes to reverse the declines that they themselves are responsible for. So I want to use 3 examples from my own work here at UMSL, and these 3 pictures illustrate those 3 examples. On the left, we have fishermen cleaning fish in the Galapagos Islands, and this is not the image that you would normally think of when you think of Galapagos. In Galapagos, you think of giant tortoises or albatross or whatever, but you don't think of people. People live on 4 of the 16 islands. The middle picture is Madagascar. So again, when you think of Madagascar, you don't think of people. So the Galapagos are a set of islands that are off of the west coast of South America on the equator. Madagascar is an island nation that is off the east coast of Africa, near the equator. And when you think of Madagascar, you think of lemurs, or those googly-eyed chameleons whose eyes go in different directions. They are all in Madagascar. So both Galapagos and Madagascar are iconic for being endemic. That is, most of the species there occur only there. So they are biodiversity hotspots. And in Madagascar, only 7% of the original forest cover remains. That's the speed at which things are being lost now. The third example on the right is a picture taken about 1.5 miles that way in Ferguson. So, and it's more ominous because the people in that picture are angry and because it's taken at night, and so it looks more ominous. But this is one of the protests following the Michael Brown shooting. But we are working in North St. Louis. It is not a biodiversity hotspot. Any biodiversity that had been there is long gone. But it is an environmental hotspot problem. So that's Westlake landfill on the right. It is one of the biggest EPA cleanup sites, and the people in North County are being exposed to whatever is coming out of that cleanup site. There is little appreciation for nature in North County because they're exposed to very little nature. So those are the 3 examples to give you, and I want to go through them very quickly. The Galapagos Islands, we started working there in 2001. And our focus is on animal health. So there are these iconic animals that are still there, and they are being subjected to new pathogens that are brought in for all the trade and tourism. So we want to know what are the health problems, and our second mission is to build human capacity so that when we're no longer there, the capable people who are there can keep up with this problem. It's an ongoing problem of introduction of new pathogens. So we offered workshops, and we brought veterinarians from the St. Louis Zoo, and they taught workshops. The workshops were very well attended, but they had practically no impact. And the reason is that there was no structure present. So when somebody discovered a sick animal, they didn't know who to take it to. There was no identified structure that would address this problem. So we tried a number of things. Our scientific part was very successful. We published over 200 papers and a book on the problem. We know what pathogens are there. We know how they're moving around. The capacity building part was a slap failure. For 11 years, we made no progress. And then finally, Ecuador itself realized that this is a problem, and they instituted a new agency, a new government agency on the islands called ABG, the Agency for Biosecurity Galapagos. And because of our long work there, they asked us for training. So we brought up some of the scientists from the ABG, and here they are in my lab on the left with some of my graduate students, 5 scientists. And we trained them in disease testing methods, and they went back to their jobs at the ABG in Galapagos, and in 2018 they opened the first ever disease testing lab on the islands run by the local people. They are owning that problem, and they are going to be able to take care of that problem going into the future. So the next example is Madagascar. So Madagascar is a different set of problems, but it is one of the most biodiverse nations on Earth. But because of the poverty and the slash and burn agriculture, it is losing habitat just at an unprecedented rate. So our approach there has been different, and we have recruited young Malagasy scientists. This is Fidi Solo Rasante Mariv on the left, Cynthia Hanwa in the middle, and Heratina Ranavella on the right. And Heratina and Cynthia are plant scientists. Fidi on the left, Dr. Rasame Mariv, is an animal scientist. And they have all now earned their PhDs and are back in Madagascar. And what Fidi has done is to himself initiate the first ever wildlife disease testing lab in Madagascar on the islands, and his mission is not only to provide a rapid response to disease outbreaks without having to send samples to France or the United States for testing, but also to provide training to brilliant young local scientists so that they themselves can become part of this local army addressing this problem and stopping the advance of the problem. And then the third and final example is the one in our own backyard. Capacity building to our North St. Louis neighbors. We initiated in 2015 a paid summer internship program for really bright young students from the Jennings School District. This school district is 100% African American and 100% free lunch eligible. So those kids cannot take the nice summer internships that more affluent students from more affluent districts can, because they have to work in the summer to put food on the table. So we have found funding and offered paid summer internships now. 60 students have been through them. Here are a collection of them again in my lab with my graduate students who are themselves from Ecuador, Papua New Guinea, Madagascar, Peru, and Jordan. So the students are coming in, they're not only seeing a different concept of understanding nature and appreciating nature, but they're seeing that people from around the world, many of whom look like them, care about this and that it's important. Oops, sorry, stop. They now, from the 2016-2017 cohort, there are 22 graduates, 19 of whom are in 12 different colleges and universities in 8 different states. And so we are very proud of that record. They now have a new appreciation of nature. Thank you.
You gotta love Professor Parker's enthusiasm. Okay, let's see. The next talk is by Linwood Tavi, Associate Professor, Director of Economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City.
Good afternoon. The title of this, Ecological and Community Economic Development. I'm not going to talk much about community economic development, but the reason it's here is because what I'm going to present is an outcome of some community economic development work I've been doing in Kansas City for almost 20 years. And this particular set of work comes because of the work with a graduate student of mine, a recent doctoral graduate. And in the process of us working on the meta theory or methodological framework that I've been developing for about 20 years, we came to a realization that there was a potential connection with our work in ecological economics. Okay, and so, do I move forward? Oh, the green one. Okay, this one. Okay. No. Okay. So let's talk about the idea of 2 Nobel Prize winners. in economics with regard to what's called prospect theory. The idea of the decision frame is an idea that to decision makers, the conception of the facts, how they think about things, affects how they think about the outcomes of their decisions. And so, for example, given the same decision problem, due to what's called framing bias, people are more likely to choose the option associated with positive framing as opposed to negative framing. And they become risk-taking in that context. The decision for each side would be the same decision, but if you present it in a positive way, people are more likely to take risks than if you present it in a negative way, the contrary of that. And so we're utilizing that work to move this process. And so, okay, so some definitions. Ecological economics, from the definition of business ecological economics is a growing transitional field of industry that expand economic theory, expand economic theory, current theory, in order to get to good outcomes. There's an assertion that ecological economics itself is hampered in its aim by its reliance on the standard economics conceptualizations of resources, capital, and assets, which produces a particular frame of positivity which affects the way that ecological economics is going to see the world. So here's a question. How might we reconceptualize or reframe ecological economics concepts to support policy making for sustainable development? If I can get, okay. No. What is going on? No. I can go backwards easily. I've got a button that says backwards. I don't know what it is. Degree. Okay. Okay, so some further definitions. The community development work that we use as part of our framework uses what's called a community capitalist framework, which is a way of thinking about 7 capitals. Now, for economists, 7 capitals is blasphemy. There's only one capital for some, it's money. Perhaps human capital, but the others, social, political, cultural, these are not things that economists study. I use the term of development here, which comes from Gunnar, which is development is the upward movement, the movement upward of the entire social system. Very simple definition that we hope encompasses everything that development is supposed to be. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And there are various definitions of these 3, but we're going to go with these. And so, also, in concepts, resources, capital, and asset. Now I'm going to highlight something in this slide. Resources are So look at the highlighted words. Resources is connected with an asset. A resource is an asset, not resource. Capital from mainstream economics is wealth in the form of money or other assets, owned assets, or a valuable resource, or one of the three factors of production, which is a classical definition. Notice that there's resource and asset in that definition. An asset is a useful or valuable thing, person, or company. Okay. So the current framing is that we have an asset, resource is an asset, particularly money, capital is an owned asset, and a resource, assets are useful. The current framing has the following structure. The framing about assets is positive since assets by definition are good, but only if used. Everyone wants assets. There's nothing, okay, but if you notice, there's no consideration of liabilities in the definition of assets. Assets are good things to have. Resources, including natural resources, are used because they are assets. This, for us, sets up a framework where we are doing something wrong if we do not exploit the assets that are available. Assets are resources, and so we must exploit resources. It is a positive framing. You can put it in a different way and think about liabilities, but it's not done, okay? So, reconceptualization, we use 2 frameworks. I'm an institutional economist, and original institutionalist in the tradition. And so from that point of view, knowledge, resources come into being as we learn how to use what we call neutral stuff for something. Oil is not a resource except we know how to use it in internal combustion engines. That knowledge is not the store of the person who discovered oil or discovered resource or the internal combustion engine. It is a result of humankind working on problems and solving them. So the result of that, the good out of that, comes from the collective work that we've all done. Therefore, if it's owned by all of us. Okay? We also turn to, in the sociology, to a reconceptualization of the idea of capital as a process. The intention here is that we break up the framing between resources, assets, and capital. Capital is not a resource, it's not an asset. Assets also we must also think about liabilities when we think of assets, and resources are collective outcome or production of all of us. Therefore, by that framework, we should be able to think about assets and liabilities and how we, as a community, use our resources or do not use resources in order to solve the problems.
Thank you. Next presenter is John Trevathan, Professor of Language and Cultural Studies at UMSL.
Good afternoon. According to a study published about a month ago, sea level rise coming in the next few decades has been dramatically underestimated due to the inaccuracy of previous models. 300 million people will be affected by the shifts, as some coastal cities will disappear by 2050. Many of the most vulnerable situations are in Southeast Asia. The authors have created interactive maps to help us explore coastal regions that are already dealing with unprecedented flooding and will face the threat of disappearance on a scale that previously had not been considered possible. It is important to emphasize how difficult it is to imagine the consequences of these shifts, especially since they will go on to trigger their own sets of effects. Over the last few years, some of my research has focused on the connections between climate collapse and mass migration. It is overwhelming to start considering what this future will look like. Indeed, there are no precedents for the scale of these changes. It is no wonder then that climate anxiety and climate grief have gained currency in contemporary discourse. The framework has a lot to tell us about the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I'll focus on Goal 15, which is, I quote, protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation, and halt biodiversity loss, end of quotation. What are the prospects given the current trends? The emerging fields of the environmental humanities offer many important strategies towards approaching global issues like sea level rise. I will explore one strategy best posed as a question. How do we reorient ourselves after having lost our bearings due to new vulnerabilities and state shifts that wouldn't have been considered possible in the span of human history? In sum, we not only face a crisis of global ecological collapse, but also a crisis of imagination. The latter is clearly visible today in both political and cultural registers. The dynamic work coming from the environmental humanities is a set of pathways meant to give us new bearings for how to act and think when our previous models fail us. This involves turning back and retelling forgotten stories about humans, creatures, and environments, especially when these tales entangle rather than separate humanity from the biosphere. It also means critically examining many of our tacit assumptions and values connected to collective socioeconomic behavior. In sum, it means learning to be surprised. Let me illustrate with an example. About a year ago, a student gave me a copy of a Peruvian novel from 1970 that ended up being a part of a seminar that I taught the following spring. Redoble por Rancas, Drums for Rancas by Manuel Scorza, tells tales from the town of Cerro de Pasco, which is there. High up in the Peruvian Andes, giving it proximity to the long history of extractive mining practices, which quickly began after the Spanish conquest of the region in the 16th century and continue today. During the 1903 carnival in the novel, many locals began to change colors. At first, the assumption was that their skin had changed to red, green, or yellow as a part of their costumes. Carnival is, after all, the world upside down. But after the holidays ended, the red, green, and yellow skin remained. Around the same time, there was a massive bird die-off. Then 30,000 sheep died. These are stories about the effects in one of the most contaminated places on Earth. Yet what is striking about the novel is that at first, there is no explanation for this ecocide. And that is how environmental toxicity works. Its activity is often invisible, only giving us staggering consequences with no immediate idea as to the causes. The novelist thankfully provides us with some detective work closely tied to the actual history of the region. The Cerro de Pasco Corporation, founded in 1903, picked up where the Spanish Empire had left off. The goal was to acquire more land and dig deeper under the exhausted veins for the mother lode. It turned out that many of these deposits were under the town itself. Here is one photograph that conveys what this looked like in 2015. What we cannot see here, however, are all the effects of the mine's contamination. More than half of the town's children have tested for high levels of lead, likely a consequence of the mine's tailings. So, what does restoration mean in such a situation? Given the centuries of exploitation and damage wrought on the area, restoration for this community itself most likely will involve relocation and the abandonment of a town that is over 400 years old. But more broadly, the story harkens back to the question I posed previously. Restoration, if that is the right word, is about reorientation after we have lost our bearings. It is about digging deeper to find inspiring stories about humans and ecosystems forging new symbiotic relationships in a damaged world. Thank you.
Okay, the final talk for this session is going to be presented by Morris Warren, Associate Professor of Communication Media Studies at UMSL.
I uploaded the box. All right, well, I'll wing it. So what you would picture right now, what you would see is a large photograph of the banner on the UMSL campus that says, "We transform lives." And if you're gonna hang a giant banner on a building that says you transform lives, you better believe it. I do believe it. Campuses are leaders. We're teaching things, and we're also sending the next generation of citizens out into the world. Here at UMSL, we are an anchor institution in a city that needs us. So when it comes to sustainability, we need to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. But sustainability has a communication problem. In the study of science communication, we talk about the deficit model. This is to say that people lack information, and that if you can just fill that deficit by giving them information, they will do the right thing. It doesn't work that way. There is a time and a place for educating people. But the reality is, we all have way more information in our lives than we can handle. Scientists and environmentalists need to think and act more like marketers. We need to make our actions and our beliefs palatable in less substantive ways. We need to sell our efforts. You may have noticed in the program that there are a lot of names in addition to mine for my listing. I included all those people on my team because I wanted everybody to see that we have people from all parts of campus working on sustainability at UMSL. I'm faculty, but not in the sciences. I work with adjunct faculty, a graduate student who is also a former undergraduate here, and staff in the form of a sustainability coordinator who's here today, and a groundskeeper. You better not be the one driving that lawnmower. I'll have words with him afterwards. So not only do we have people at all levels of campus doing really good things for the earth, what they're doing is good for campus as well. And I say that not just because we're leaders in the way that I mentioned before, but also in the sense that we are in a battle with other universities and life paths for the young people in our region and state. Sharing our sustainability efforts is a recruitment and retention strategy. There's plenty of research showing that millennials and members of Generation Z make purchasing and lifestyle decisions based on the values that they hold. This environmental stuff matters to them. And if my slides were here, I would show you a pretty simple bar graph that's data that I collected in the last 2 months here at UMSL. I had almost 500 participants, and it was a representative sample with significant and proportionate numbers of undergrads, grad students, staff, faculty, online-only learners, people of color. It was a very nice sample. And what it showed is that the vast majority of them strongly agree with the statement that they want to be at a university that is green, that engages in environmental efforts. Nobody strongly disagreed, and more people strongly agreed than agreed, is what you would see. People across the board, all walks of campus, care whether their university is doing the right thing in this context. So what that means is that we want people to we want to be on a campus that functions in sustainable ways, and we have people all over campus who are advancing that agenda, but very few people know about these efforts. Another question that I would have shown you from my data are that UMSL gets decent marks when people ask it, does your campus act as a leader in sustainability? But not everybody sees it as a leader. Most people were fairly neutral about that. Yet, this is a campus with rain gardens. This is a campus with interpretive signage. This is a campus with a community garden that was created through work of undergraduate students on honors projects. This is a campus with a groundskeeper who, along with an adjunct, sought out to get and received a grant to restore a native prairie on South Campus. We have a sustainability division. We have a sustainability coordinator who's here today who has set action agendas and short-term and long-term goals and is mapping those goals onto the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Wow, this is a real opportunity. So what I'd like to point out now is that we need to fix this communication problem and offer a few suggestions as to how. First suggestion, you have to communicate. Case in point, our groundskeeper got permission to maintain several low-mow areas on campus. These are areas with little to no foot traffic where you can allow the grass to grow longer without mowing, and it's very good for pollinators. He put up some signs identifying them. He made sure to keep a very neat, tidy border around the perimeter of them. Yet some residents in neighboring communities around UMSL didn't like the look. They called the chancellor. They complained. Word came down, start mowing weekly. This is a communication problem, a problem that communication can solve, and I guarantee it can be done shorter, more quickly and less expensively than mowing a no-mow zone once a week. Another example is this research summit, centered around a theme of sustainability. All 4 of the UM campuses have sustainability coordinators. They were not initially notified about this meeting. The left hand has to start knowing what the right hand is doing. Point number 2, when we do communicate, don't assume everybody wants to be talked to in a high involvement kind of way. People are busy, they're disinterested, they're tired. We can communicate with them, but we need to do it using heuristics. We need to brand our efforts. And finally, my last tip, all of this advice is not really optional. If we don't speak up, we don't control the narrative, and if we don't control the narrative, then somebody else will. I greatly lament the fact that I'm not able to show you the 14-second TikTok video that I have selected for you. If you don't know what TikTok is, your students do. This is something that was created and delivered and shared by an UMSL undergraduate in which he says, here at UMSL, we really care about the environment. You can see it in our separate recycling for our separate trash cans for recycling and regular waste. And he goes over to a trash can that has 2 slots, one for recycling, one for trash, and he lifts the lid, and you can see underneath that it's just one giant trash can with everything going to the same place. It's been viewed over 1,400 times. So I don't want to sound overly critical. Obviously in 5 minutes, I can't also spend as much time on solutions as I did on problems. And I also don't mean to imply that there isn't any time for educating or informing people. There definitely is for people who are interested and have the motivation, but in the meantime, we need strategic communication initiatives that tie into our mission of transforming lives. We have a tremendous opportunity here. Thank you.
So if the speakers would like to come up and to the front again and form a panel. Is Katie Mike still here?
Yep.
Why don't you come up as well? Okay, anybody else who was on? Yeah, there should be seats. If we don't, we'll grab some more. Come on up, yeah. I guess you could stand or grab a chair or whatever. Those two there. Okay, again, microphones in the center aisle. If you have questions, please come up and speak through the microphone.
Hi, April Register, faculty member here in the College of Ed. Laura, you did a great job. I'm bummed not to see your slides. I have a question.
He's going to circulate.
Okay. A question that was kind of circulated in my group over here. Does UMSL recycle? Okay.
We recycle, we do a lot of amazing things. We recycle electronics, we have a program with Sodexo that recycles food waste, if I'm not mistaken.
Even coffee grounds are composted. We've received over $40,000 in grant money to put more bins out on campus. And so it's a communication issue. We do recycle.
Thanks.
This is a follow-up, and I'm on South Campus. And it's a little bit concerning that our recycling is actually making it to recycle. We noticed that our recycling bins are covered with the plastic trash bags, and they seem to go directly out with the trash. And I know that we have some custodial service issues right now with the overall. It doesn't really seem to be recycled. Why we would have it? Is it an illusion of recycling?
We are indeed recycling, and our diversion rate is actually getting better and better. So that's something that we're tracking data-wise. We know what kind of tonnage we're sending to the landfill and what kind of tonnage we're sending to the materials from our facility. But just as though it's important for us to communicate to the people that are doing the recycling, it's just as important for us to communicate internally with the custodial staff to make sure they're all on board and they're aware that they need to help communicate as well.
And that goes back to what I was saying about branding the effort, because if we start to create a culture here that this is a value and that this is something that we pride ourselves on and that we do, then you're more likely to get that buy-in from all levels of people.
Hi, Laura Cole, MU Architectural Studies. I'm just curious what your big idea is. I loved this panel, by the way. There are so many great interdisciplinary voices here. What would be your biggest recommendations or greatest ideas for MU to enhance sustainable development in our system? Just curious.
Anybody?
I don't know a ton about MU. I mean, I know everything there is sort of on a larger scale than it is here. So obviously that would require research as to what you guys are doing. But I just keep going back to the fact that we're all competing for the same finite and I believe demographically sinking number of warm bodies. You know, the young people, there's not as many of them. And it needs to be part of the environment. We've batted this around quite a bit. Do we go with the name UMSL Sustainability? Do we make it green? But I would say that in all cases, you just want to hammer that message home consistently. So whatever MU decides to do, whatever's a match for their facilities, it should be echoed in promotional materials when students visit, potential prospective students visit, at the football games, wherever. It needs to be a unified message.
I would say the best person to answer that question isn't here today. Raghu is your sustainability coordinator. He's very well versed in all of this, and he probably has some very specific action items that he would list off in a heartbeat, because every campus is a little bit unique in that way.
How many people knew their campus had a sustainability department and coordinator?
There's a student of mine who's working on a project where she wants to ask the question of Missouri farmers of, one, what they think about the climate crisis, whether they agree or not that there's a climate crisis, but then also wants to interrogate them on whether or not they are buying insurance to hedge against the effects of climate crisis. And what she finds is that farmers are not stupid. They know what's going on with their crops, and if insurance is available, they will buy insurance while they will politically say, we don't believe in climate change. This to me seems to be a rural urban issue, that we have people who are not talking to each other, not coming to a sensible conclusion that it's possible that there is climate change, but there may be some political differences that we need to communicate our differences so that we can start a dialogue. And I say that because of the communication panel, but also because of the context of MU. MU is in a rural area. Our flagship campus is surrounded by a rural community. UMKC and also are obviously urban communities, and so there may be different ideas about what we do about sustainability, but farmers are not stupid.
Yeah, we've got time for one more question.
Caroline Davies, UMKC. I love the panel. The panel is wonderful. I just want to let you know we no longer have a sustainability office or coordinator. I probably could have given that talk about what we've done on campus 5 years ago, but 3 years ago we closed the office and laid off the coordinator. So I absolutely agree that communication is huge to the community, to our academic structure up to the top, and I would invite you to come and do your survey on our campus so that, but the students are driving what's happening now, and they are working on a sustainability fee, self-imposed by students, on students, to generate some dollars. And it's a really good model. Johnson County Community College charges their students $3 per credit hour for sustainability alone, which has created an enormous fund. You could do it with far less. And it also gets the word out that sustainability is really important, not just as a class topic, but as an ethic on your campus. So yes, communication, thank you.
So we've got a great panel here. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to engage them fully. When this is over, we actually will, we're not going to clear the room immediately. I would suggest that people stay around, engage the panel and other colleagues in conversation, and keep the discussion going. I think this is a really, really important subject. So I would encourage you all to, again, engage with the panel here, ask them more questions, and keep the conversation moving. Thank you, panel. Okay, we're on the second afternoon session. Our first speaker, Kathleen Preble, Assistant Professor, School of Social Work at MU.
So the ultimate call for social justice. How UN Sustainable Development Goals in Missouri are working to end human trafficking. Sustainable Development Goals provide a global framework to address the world's most pressing concerns, many of which can be found here locally. here in Missouri, we not only see international persons being exploited, but we also see U.S. citizens trafficked for labor and sexual purposes. Indeed, the vulnerabilities to becoming trafficked include some of the very factors that SDGs intend to mitigate: adverse childhood experiences, IPV, migration, unstable immigration statuses, lack of education and employment opportunities, age, racial and ethnic, and gender and sexual minority statuses are all recognized as risk factors for many forms of isolation, poverty, and violence experiences, including human trafficking. As a consequence, survivors of trafficking experience mental health and trauma-related injury, physical health problems, substance use issues, stigma, and difficulty finding employment due to criminal justice history. Human trafficking and exploitation is explicitly mentioned within goals 5, 8, and 16, but the other 5 goals presented here all add to the work toward a world free from human exploitation and slavery. Each goal targets specific nuances to addressing the prevention or aftercare of human trafficking experiences, of the vulnerabilities and impacts we just discussed. In sum, by addressing the most fundamental human needs and prioritizing gender equality, education, decent work, fair and transparent governance, and global and local partnerships, we can start to tackle this enormously complex social problem, not just abroad, but here in our own backyards. While my specific research is focused mostly on Missouri, I hope for the same outcomes expressed in the UN's SDGs: access to basic services, empowerment, and sustainability. However, broadly, research in the United States is nascent. And so much of what anti-trafficking researchers like myself focus on relates to understanding the basics around the phenomenon and its impacts on survivors, communities, and industries. Here in Missouri, we've been able to shed light on the landscape of human trafficking, creating a clearer picture and a puzzle piece that makes up the greater Midwestern region. This in turn helps us understand what's happening in the United States and broader still in the global context. Through our environmental scan, needs assessment, and strategic planning, my colleagues, some of whom are in this room, identified among the most needed services in Missouri for survivors include crisis shelter, transitional housing, and appropriate trauma-informed mental health care. Also needed are economic and educational assistance programs, as well as substance use treatment. There's a critical need among the anti-trafficking professionals in the state for nuanced and more advanced and nuanced training curricula, as well as multidisciplinary team coordination. And we are currently strategizing how to address these needs through existing resources, better resource integration, and more purposeful planning. Additionally, I'm seeking to understand what identities and resiliencies survivors relied on while they were being exploited, to better understand how we can approach survivors engaging in aftercare services to empower them to lead their authentic lives. And how might this understanding better inform prevention programming for human trafficking? And due to the nascent nature of anti-trafficking programming in the United States, survivors are often served through programs meant for other survivor populations, like domestic and sexual violence. In examining service outcomes of trafficking survivors engaged in service contexts, we can begin to understand whether they are appropriate and adequate for the needs of human trafficking survivors, how these outcomes impact intervention, programmatic modifications, if at all. What about policy development? And what might minimum standards of care for serving trafficking survivors in these contexts, what might they look like? And certainly we in the university community contribute to SDGs 16 and 17 by serving the public through education, policy development, economic and workforce development, and scientific engagement leading to the evidence-based practices to actualize these SDGs. We are responsible to, as well as hold accountable, our communities to create safe, responsible spaces to lead transparent and thriving human experience. To do this, we in the anti-trafficking movement depend upon public and private partnerships to prevent, protect, and hold accountable to protect the survivors and prevent human trafficking, hold accountable the perpetrators of the social injustice. In doing our small part to make a clear picture of human trafficking in Missouri, we are helping to enhance anti-trafficking knowledge nationally and internationally. And I'm always interested in new collaborations to make this happen. Thank you.
I was gonna say, can we back them up? Okay, while we're backing the slides up, our next speaker is Jacob Marshallek, Associate Professor of Psychology, UMKC.
There we go. Thank you very much. I'm Jacob Marshallek, and my partner in crime here is Johanna Nielsen. She sends her regrets. She's on her way to Sweden at the moment, so she couldn't make it today. We are addressing in our research Goal 16, Peace, Justice, and Strong Institutions. Institutions that are ideally positioned to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development are those that nurture the growth of or address the problems of a person's physical, psychological, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And those include things like hospitals, schools, mental health clinics, and so on. But those are just buildings. Institutions are made of people. And so the people that are making up these institutions are people in the helping professions, counselors, psychologists, doctors, nurses, teachers, and other educators. A cornerstone for building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions is to help those individual members develop social justice advocacy. Social justice advocacy is at the core of global citizenship education. Any educational endeavor has as a key component assessment. So a question that we had was, so if we want social justice advocacy to be a professional competency that we have instilled in our training programs for the helping professions, how can we assess it? So we decided to begin to conceptualize social justice advocacy as just being of two main components. Social justice, which we defined as where fairness and equity are valued for marginalized individuals and groups, and advocacy, where advocacy focuses on action. Action that is directed toward changing or transforming the process by which public decisions are made. So we used that definition and we generated about 100 items for a questionnaire and vetted it through some subject matter experts in social justice advocacy. And then we administered those items and refined the scale. And through our secret formula, we settled on 27 items that factored into 4 key dimensions. And those dimensions are social issues awareness, being aware of the social issues that are salient in society, political awareness, just overall awareness of political trends and policies, political and social advocacy, things like writing your congressman, voting, marching in demonstrations, and confronting discrimination. These would be items, questions that ask people whether they think it's their responsibility to stand up for those who are marginalized. This scale had very good, strong psychometrics, and so given that, what can we do with it? How can we use it to develop social justice advocacy in our students? Well, one practical strategy for using it is to define mastery criteria. define the mastery criteria for each of those attributes, the 4 attributes that are up on the screen. Mastery criteria are benchmarks that indicate when a person has reached the desired level of a given construct, like social justice advocacy. So we used a process called cognitive diagnostic modeling to develop diagnostic profiles for mastery. Cognitive diagnostic modeling uses item response theory and latent class analysis and really gives us an elegant tool for using a single model to develop these diagnostic profiles. And using a single model helps us to be very precise and eliminate a lot of the measurement error that's involved with conducting such profiles. Now I'm saying diagnostic profiles like it's some kind of medical procedure, but it's actually, you can call it mastery profiles. So when you have 4 attributes, like we do with the social justice, for the social issues awareness scale, which is the scale that we developed, you can have a pattern of 16 possible profiles of having achieved mastery or not on each of those 4 attributes. So we went ahead and we ran the analysis with about 786 people, and the results that we found were interesting. Some of the results are right here. As you can see, we had about a quarter of the sample. Well, maybe you can't see, the font's a little small, but take my word for it. A quarter of the sample had profiles that were associated with having the attitudes for social justice advocacy, but not the action. And then about an eighth had a little bit more of attitude and a little bit more of action. And then about a little bit less had complete and total mastery. So what we're going to do next, or what we did do, is we went and we recognized that we wanted to get people further to action, and these are other results. We developed a conceptual framework with focus group interviews, and we expanded the scale to 4 additional dimensions. And next steps for us are to shorten the scale down to a usable sample size, and we're going to use that to do another cognitive diagnostic model so that we can track the development of our trainees through their programs. Thank you.
Thanks. Next up is Michael Gerhardt, Assistant Professor of Social Work from the University of Missouri St. Louis.
That was one of the nicest things you've ever said about me. Thank you. All right, so I am a professor at the University of Missouri St. Louis School of Social Work. Just as a side note, everything you see in quotations on my PowerPoint slide, including "we've diagnosed the problem but are hoping it goes away," is a quote from a Ferguson resident. So I love starting with this "why care?" question, and this quote up here is an oldie but a goodie. Ferguson is a mirror of our culture. The challenges that we're facing, the tensions, the conversations that we should have had decades ago but haven't, not unique to Ferguson, not unique to St. Louis, not unique to Missouri. Now I say it's an oldie and a goodie because that's from my first study that I did here in the Ferguson Community Empowerment Center. To keep things new and fresh, I'm going to present things on my Ferguson Community Assessment, which is a deep dive in the perceptions of residents of Ferguson. And they identify 3 main domains for sustainable development: political, social, and economic. Now, politically, how do I put this nicely? Folks are saying that there are higher functioning metropolitan areas than St. Louis. What can we learn from them? Similarly, it's also important to acknowledge that our current system of governance was fueled by racial tension, income inequality, differences between city and county that nowadays look kind of petty. Also important that we emphasize diversity in leadership and leaders who listen to their constituents. And when we talk about development, it's not just about the economy, it's about people. However, folks also acknowledge that some problems won't be legislated away. We have an issue of folks not being treated like human beings, and we have to talk about how that is a problem. Whenever I talk about what I do at cocktail parties or dinner parties, there's an uncomfortable proportion of folks who say, "Don't talk about race." And I say, "Okay, cool, let's talk about income." Those of you chuckling are ahead of me. They're like, "Don't talk about that either." Like, we have these problems simmering beneath the surface. We'd much rather have them boil over, deal with it in crisis mode, and then ignore it. And I threw in this last bullet point about an honest education, just free with your tuition, because I've received a very Disneytized, whitewashed version of US history. And folks believe that if you incorporate the fact that yes, there's limitless potential for good, but then also terrible atrocities in our history, if you can combine those two worldviews, that is a critical step for a sustainable future. Now, I want to camp out on this economic slide for a little bit. Folks are talking about, yes, it's important to do economic development. Bring in businesses, bring in black-owned businesses, just bring in businesses, period. However, folks are also saying what we don't need is gentrification masses economic development. And I think that's important here at UMSL for two main reasons. One, a lot of the conversation around gentrification in St. Louis is whether or not the economic development we're seeing meets the textbook definition of gentrification. For those of you that don't know, gentrification means when you develop an area economically, the cost of living goes up. So folks who used to be able to live in a certain neighborhood can no longer afford to do so, and they are displaced. Semantics are important, language is important, but if that's all we talk about, we're rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. I'm seeing development of $500,000 and $700,000 homes in Lafayette Square. We're seeing apartments being built in Central West End, Tower Grove, Dogtown. And when you look at the rents of those buildings, they're 2 to 3 times the median rent for the city of St. Louis. I don't care if that meets the textbook gentrification or textbook definition of gentrification. That's going to perpetuate income inequality across the region. And we got to be talking about that too. And then finally, I think it's important here because we're announcing $60 million of development in Normandy, which is where we all are. I'm cautiously optimistic because we're here as an anchor institution as UMSL, but I also, as the folks in Ferguson are like pushing me towards this idea of ethical economic development, I'm wondering if we're leaving some things on the table. Because most anchor institutions don't have content experts in community engagement. Hopefully at the presentation today you can see that we at UMSL do. We're also researchers, so we're nerds. We like to evaluate and talk about what we do. So I'm wondering if we can leverage this opportunity as an anchor institution in this development to not only be a good anchor institution, but then under the best case scenario for community development, have the conversation of this is what anchor institutions ought to be. And with that, I believe that is all I got. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, next presenter is Sung-Yeop Kim, Professor of Urban Planning and Design at UMKC.
So population aging is a local and regional and national and global issues. We live in an aging society. The population aging has substantial implications in equities. Even though we don't feel very well because we work in academic institutions, the ageism is real. You will realize that if you work in private sector, if you reach mid-40s, you begin to feel pressures. So, but these, the equity issues can prevail in many different ways. But I have found that transportation equity can be a substantial issue in an aging society. The older adults are considered as one of the transportation disadvantaged because of their limited income and limited physical abilities. They often face significant mobility problems, in particular if they don't drive. But existing study shows that whether the person can drive or not is one of the most significant factors that basically affects older adults' mobility. Even my own research shows that consistently, whether the person is driving or not is the most significant factor. Also, one of my research shows that it's based on Seattle. The activity space of those who don't drive is only 16% of the average activity space of people who drive. So the gap is just tremendous. Some study actually shows that higher density can help people who don't drive, particularly among older adults. and public transit maybe alleviates some pressures. But many studies shows that they only have very limited impacts. In fact, the reason why is public transit is largely designed for commuting trips. So all the drivers, often who are retired, they don't actually commute. So also the service level during daytime is significantly reduced. So there are not many options for older adults who want to use public transit. Also, there are many cities and places that provide voluntary driving services for those older adults who need some transportations. But I have found that usually people who take advantage of those services are financially savvy, highly educated older adults. Usually people who are actually less educated, low income, usually they don't get the services. I think there's a clearly kind of information barrier that somehow block that more disadvantaged adults use those type of services. I actually working on one of my paper, actually 2017 National Household Travel Survey data actually shows that more than 50% of older adults that has some medical issues that somehow limit the driving, they still drive. So they actually pose tremendous safety issues too. But we cannot just blame those older adults who, even though they should not drive, they still drive. The reason why is they do not have alternatives. If they don't drive in many places, they are stuck at home. There's no actually alternatives. Also, the taking away driver's license is from older adults is a very emotional issue. In America, driver's license means independence and freedom. Right, so you may have some relative and family member who may have some issues, right? Don't drive very well, but still they do not want to give up their driver's license. Your friend, your relative, family members are not an exception. That's one of many. But we actually found that the driver's license actually only 1 minute, okay. So male, female, there's just a gender gap. Females are a lot less likely to own driver's license as they ages. Also, women, particularly minority women, tend to have lowest level of mobilities. So national data shows that minority females, they actually face more serious mobility problems. Also, the income matters. Low-income older adults are facing more serious problem. The implication of this, the economic data shows that we expect a declining income among older adults, income indicates. And one of the recent studies shows that the bankruptcy rates among older adults has been increased tremendously compared to any other groups. So we now know that the income issue will come, and then they play a very significant role. So safety is also same issues. I want to actually show this. Older adults are more likely to be involved in pedestrian crashes, and they are a lot more likely to be fatally injured. So there are a lot of issues that somehow studies that somehow how we can address these issues. But in my opinion, the most critical issue is we know what to do, but those things have not been implemented. I think that's one of the critical issues that in transportation in an aging societies. Thank you. So I want to say this actually finally. I have not seen anyone who doesn't ages. So I think this is something that I really want to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker is Shirley Porterfield from the School of Social Work at University of Missouri St. Louis.
Good afternoon. I'm Shirley Porterfield. I'm a professor in the School of Social Work, and I'm actually an affiliated professor in public policy program here at UMSL as well. I want to acknowledge my colleagues, Baran Gual from the School of Social Work here at UMSL, and then Jin Huang, who's at St. Louis University. We have been working on kind of a group of related projects, and so given the short structure, I'm going to present an overview of the larger picture from this body of work. I think reaching the Sustainable Development Goals that are the focus of this symposium requires making the most of all the resources at our disposal. And reaching these goals requires not just individual effort, but state and federal policy structures that support progress for all individuals, of all abilities. So these research projects all focus on policy impacts on young adults with disabilities. 1 in 5 families have a child with special health care needs, meaning they use more medical services than a typical child of their age. Some of these children have chronic conditions or disabilities that are remediated or controlled by the time they reach adulthood, but for about half, the disabling conditions are lifelong. As these children transition out of school and into young adulthood, the public social policy rules that govern who receives support services change and require redetermination of disability. The Social Security Administration determines disability for both children and adults with those definitions shown on this slide. In the years just prior to the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, or ACA, point-in-time estimates found that over 40% of young adults with disabilities were uninsured, as compared to 30% of their non-disabled young adults. Just over 1/3 worked, about 2/3 of adults work in this country, and 20% were in poverty. 1/3 of those who receive supplemental security income, or SSI, as children lose eligibility when they transition to young adulthood. And because SSI is tied to eligibility for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, what we know of as food stamps, many young adults become food insecure during this transition. Food security is defined by researchers at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, as shown on the slide. Just over 14% of young adults with disabilities are food insecure, without disabilities, are food insecure, while 35% of young adults with disabilities are food insecure. The gap in food insecurity actually widens between those with and without disabilities as they age from child to adulthood. The 2 lines shown at the top of this chart are for children and young adults with disabilities who do, that's the top line, and do not, that's the second line from the top, receive SNAP benefits. Food insecurity is strongly linked to poor health and poor mental health in all age groups. So in our research, we've used 9 years of data from the National Health Interview Survey, including restricted geographic codes, to examine changes in health insurance coverage and access to health care from pre-ACA to post-ACA years. And looking just at the post-ACA time period, primarily because food insecurity wasn't asked until 2011, we have examined the impact of SNAP benefits on food insecurity and the impact of food insecurity on health status and access to health care. Our work in this area has shown significantly increased health insurance coverage and lower reported unmet healthcare needs, affecting perhaps 2.9 million young adults overall and nearly 300,000 young adults with disabilities. Largest reductions in uninsurance were due to Medicaid expansion. We did not find that SNAP benefits significantly reduced food insecurity among young adults with disabilities, though we did find that food insecurity is associated with both poor reported health status and higher unmet healthcare needs. We recommend that nutrition assistance be included in transition planning for youth with disabilities. So are SNAP benefits important? Yes, but perhaps not more important for young adults with disabilities than for those without. Money is fungible, so any expenditures on food that are offset by receipt of SNAP benefits should improve well-being. In Medicaid expansion states, the ACA removed one barrier to employment by removing the requirement that people with disabilities be in poverty to get health insurance coverage. The dependent coverage provision, Medicaid expansion, and access to health insurance through the marketplace exchanges without disability-specific underwriting, provide opportunities for young adults to seek post-secondary education, training, and/or employment, and to maintain needed health insurance coverage, reducing what has been dubbed in the literature as health insurance-motivated disability enrollment. Evidence from other published research, actually researchers at KU, suggests that this has been the case in Medicaid expansion states where working-age adults with disabilities are more likely to be employed than those in non-expansion states, and where SSI enrollment has dropped since implementation of Medicaid expansion. So thanks to the folks at Mizzou and elsewhere who helped with use of restricted data, and many thanks to our funders, the University of Kentucky Center for Poverty Research, the U.S. Department of Agriculture Economic Research Service and Food and Nutrition Service, and the Health Resources and Services Administration. Thanks.
Thanks, Shirley. Next speaker is Jessica Cundiff, Assistant Professor of Psychological Sciences at Missouri S&T.
Hi. So I'll start off by going through women are underrepresented in STEM careers and in senior leadership. These are high-paying, highly valued career fields, and so why is this a problem? I probably don't have to explain it to you, but diverse workforces are essential for providing a broad range of perspective and creative solutions to problems. Within STEM fields, those jobs are in high supply, but there's not enough people in the STEM pipeline to actually meet those growing job demands. But this is also a social justice issue in that STEM careers and senior leadership positions are high paying, and so underrepresentation of women perpetuates the gender wage gap, for example. So there's been lots of different solutions and strategies that have been proposed to try to help recruit and retain women in STEM and advance them through their careers into leadership positions. And one of those strategies has focused on what I call women-targeted diversity initiatives. In particular, today I'm going to focus on these professional development programs, or sometimes called opportunity enhancement programs, that are specifically targeted toward women. So, for example, many science and engineering departments at universities have programs targeted specifically toward women students to provide women with mentoring and professional development. We also see this in a lot of different companies. There's programs for women at Goldman Sachs, Senior Women's Initiative, Women Partner Advocacy, at Accenture. There's women's programs, Women's Network, Google Women in Engineering, supporting women engineers, BCG Women's Initiative, GM Diversity, et cetera, et cetera. So you can find these types of programs at a lot of different companies. And so definitely those programs no doubt have positive implications by providing safe spaces for women's concerns, access to useful resources, and opportunities for networking and professional development that women may have been denied in the past. But despite those benefits, women-targeted programs might have some unintended drawbacks. For instance, they may inadvertently convey that women need help in order to succeed. They may signal that the overall climate at those companies might be negative towards women, and that's why they need those programs. And those programs could also be perceived by some as giving women an unfair advantage. And so I've conducted a couple studies in an ongoing program of research to identify what might be some of these drawbacks. It's important to understand drawbacks so that you can avoid any unintended costs, so you can maximize the benefits that these programs give. So one study I did was looking at how are these programs perceived by prospective employees. So I had participants were undergraduate students who would be going onto the job market, and I had them look at fictional company brochures. And the company brochures talked about professional development programs. They also talked about that they really cared about diversity and creating inclusive spaces for employees that was free of bias. And all of that. But I varied whether the programs offered by the companies that were described in the brochure, whether they were offered specifically toward women versus if they were kind of offered towards everyone at the company. And so this is an example. And it was a controlled experiment, so it either had, the words for women or it didn't. So I have half participants seeing for women and half participants seeing the program toward everyone. And what I found was that the diversity initiatives, these programs, and the companies themselves were perceived less positively and also as more gender biased when they targeted women versus everyone. So it seemed like, and this was the case for both women and men participants, didn't really like these programs when they were targeted towards women. In another study, I was kind of looking at, okay, well, how might these programs have consequences down the road for women who participate in these programs? How might women who participate in these programs be perceived and evaluated? And so in this study, I had participants read about an applicant for a leadership position at an engineering company. And the application, one part of the application, this is a fictional application that participants were reading. And one part of the application asked the applicant to identify, okay, what sort of training programs have you participated in at the company? And so half the participants saw this list of training programs, and they saw that the female applicant had participated in 4 out of 6 of the training programs. The other half of participants saw the same types of training programs. It was just some of them were labeled specifically for women. So the same types of programs and the same number of programs that the applicant had participated in. And then I had the participants evaluate that applicant. And what I found was that when the applicant had participated in these programs that were labeled for women, they were perceived as being less competent, less likable, less deserving of the promotion, and the participants also thought she should get a lower salary. Okay, and in a third study, I surveyed full-time working adults, and I asked them about what types of programs are implemented at your company. And they kind of rated a whole list of programs and indicated whether those programs were targeted towards women and racial minorities or if they were more generic programs. And so you could kind of divide people up into those 2 camps, people who worked at companies that had a lot of programs targeted towards specific groups, and people who worked at companies that had more generic programs and weren't really targeted towards anybody. And what I found was that the companies that had programs primarily targeted towards specific groups were disliked, they were seen unfair, and people felt like they were excluded at that company and from those programs. But perhaps not surprisingly, this was really just for white men and individuals who believe that racism and sexism is no longer a problem, so they thought that these programs weren't needed, they didn't understand them, and they felt excluded by them. And on the other hand, I had women and racial ethnic minorities dislike the company's programs if they rarely targeted them. They thought those programs were unfair and they felt excluded by those programs. And also individuals who thought that racism and sexism were still a problem didn't like it when the company only had these generic programs. And so these results seem to speak to the benefits of programs targeted towards underrepresented groups. If you only have generic programs, it seems like those programs aren't meeting the needs of diverse workers. They're not designed to level the playing field, they're not creating safe spaces, they're not counteracting bias in the workplace. So it seems like you need some sort of diversity initiatives, these programs, but at the same time, when you target them specifically toward a specific group, they might be creating tensions in the workplace. And I realize I'm out of time, but this is an ongoing program of research to kind of identify, well, now where do we go from this? I think it's important to identify some of these unintended costs so that we can avoid them, because these programs are important. We need to maximize the benefits by minimizing the costs. All right, thank you.
Okay, the final presentation of this afternoon is Lauren Barband, Assistant Professor, Department of Health Sciences at MU.
So I also just want to introduce myself. I research transgender health, understanding disparities broadly. I find that measuring gender has kind of fallen into my lap as a process of me getting at understanding health disparities with transgender individuals. I want to start with an item from a survey, from any application you fill out, from essentially anything where you have to sign up for a profile. You're going to be asked to select your gender. And more often than not, this is what you'd be most familiar with seeing, an option for male, female, and if we're lucky, there will be a category for other. Unfortunately, what happens with that other category is they're just kind of left out when doing any analyses or consideration of gender, because we don't know what other means. However, that other category experiences health concerns and health issues, including access to health care, mental health challenges, suicidality, that are never considered because we don't capture them to understand their needs in surveys right now. So here is the most current recommended approach to identifying transgender individuals or people that might otherwise fall into that other category. You've got two items on a question. The first one is your assigned sex at birth with the options of male and female. That is current, up to date. It will be for several years moving forward. There are places now where are opting out of assigning a sex at birth, which might challenge that first question, but right now, best option. And then a current gender identity option, where you have options for male, female, neither male or female, gender nonconforming, or some other variation for that last category. We know that in general, people are able to fill out this question on a survey. We know that they understand when asked sex at birth and current gender identity how to answer both of those questions. So from the standpoint of being able to use this question combination on a survey, it's positive. Just to give you an idea of how this works to identify transgender or gender nonconforming folks in a survey, you'll see that if someone marks assigned sex at birth as male and their current gender identity as male, they would be labeled as not transgender. I'm not sure how that got out there like that. So assigned sex at birth, if they identify male and they identify current gender identity as female or neither male or female, they might fall into a category of transgender. Depending on the number, we might be able to break it down by gender nonconforming or binary gender. So my question comes from a place of understanding that transgender individuals are diverse, and there's a lot of heterogeneity in the population. So I've always wondered if this question actually captures the transgender population and if I can trust this measure to work if using it from a survey. So I started this question by looking at the National Transgender Discrimination Survey. It was dated 2008. I will say that the methods and my findings are still relevant, but at the time, this was the largest sample that I had access to. So here's an example of a few items that have to do with transgender identity that I looked at. There was 15 in total, and I clustered them statistically to kind of find and discern what groups might manifest. One interesting point with these identity terms is this term over here, transgender. You would assume that included, that everyone would have said that they strongly identified with transgender, because in order to be included in this data, not only did you have to mark your assigned sex and your assigned gender as discordant, you also had to indicate that you identified as transgender or gender nonconforming. But what I can tell from this is people wanted to participate in the survey and somehow in some form identified as transgender or gender nonconforming enough so that they completed the survey, but not to the full extent, because when asked about the gender, they didn't always. So my question became, what happens when I do this? I discovered that it wasn't what I expected. There were more groups that manifested beyond just assigned males and assigned females or non-binary. So I decided to approach it by asking a question: what if we give folks the option to check all that apply on that current gender identity? What happens when I ask this? At this point, I'm only using community samples to test and look at this option for asking the question of gender. So in a community sample that only included lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer individuals, the N was 1,000. I will just say it was a breakdown of about 500 in each group because it was oversampled for the transgender population. I break down the categories in which they identified themselves by gender identity only. And you see there's this interesting thing that pops up when you get down to the non-binary and below. You see that not everyone who identifies as transgender identifies with that man-woman. So there's something going on here. But what I wanted to highlight was down here, you see among transgender individuals, about 15% are endorsing both a non-binary and a man or woman designation. This is an interesting group because my question becomes, on a survey where they can't select all that apply, which one are they selecting? And are they consistently selecting the same one? Because as a demographic variable, you want them to be consistently assessing the same one. Just a throw out there, as this is important for understanding population data, the purpose behind why we want to know that. I want to kind of tell you why it actually matters when you unfold it. So conservative estimates, transgender population is 1% of the overall population. Not transgender, but sexual minorities would be 10% of the overall population. If you look at the numbers that I pulled out in terms of the proportions that identified in that non-binary category, you'll see that the percentage is relatively the same, whether they were transgender or not transgender, but identified as a sexual minority. What this means is when looking at folks who identify as non-binary, which we know is the greatest disparate group among transgender individuals, we cannot understand that group to any capacity. We don't know if they're transgender. We don't know their health histories in terms of any level of medical need that they have. So understanding from a population or survey standpoint is extremely limited given this. So I just kind of wanted to point out here there is a problem going on, especially in this non-binary and women group, in which from that we don't know enough. So wanted to throw out some conclusions for you because I left you on this standpoint of what's next. Transgender individuals are diverse, and it is necessary to break them down into simple categories that can be asked on population surveys. Unfortunately, the current method is missing a lot in terms of what we can pull from it for understanding the transgender population. We don't know if they're accurately capturing those subgroups to understand the transgender health needs. The two-step question, at a minimum, is essential for identifying those groups. But consider a third question of asking about transgender history at a minimum. I oftentimes get questions about how do I ask gender in a survey, and my response is, it's complicated, what do you want to know? Because it really does make a difference if you're interested from an identity standpoint, from a health standpoint, what information you need to know in that question. So at this point, I guess, it matters how you measure gender. Go beyond the other in your surveys. But maybe reach out to me if you have any questions about asking gender in a survey. Thank you.
If we get the speakers back up for the Q&A session. I think we could. There we go. Okay, again, if there are any questions, please use the microphone in the center aisle.
My question is for the presenter with the diversity initiatives. What was your pool?
The participants?
Yes.
And so those were 3 different studies, so they had 3 different samples. The first 2 studies were experimental studies, so I'm a social psychologist. We tend to use undergraduate students for those ones. So for the first study, I was interested in prospective employees, so undergraduates make sense. For the survey study I presented, it was full-time working adults who were sampled using I don't know if anybody's familiar with Amazon Mechanical Turk, but you pay participants to take online surveys. So it would have been paid from that.
What was the diversity of your pool?
Oh, for the survey study?
Yes.
Would have been,
Of the working adults?
yeah, we specifically recruited people to kind of get equal numbers of women and men and also equal numbers of racial majority and minority folks.
And what was your sample size?
This is a good question. I need to look back at the data. I believe it was around 500 or more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Mike?
Thanks to all the presenters, Mike War, School Psychology Program, College of Ed. My question is also for Jessica. Jessica, as you were presenting, I was mindful of an article in the American Psychologist about 10 years ago, When Treatment Harms. And it was a study where youth with behavioral disorders were put together in a summer program because we thought that's the thing to do, and it turned out not to be the thing to do. So in thinking about your study, our initiatives are designed to be more inclusive and supportive of women in the workforce. Really what I want to do is just give you an extra minute or 2 to talk about where you're going to go from here, because I was intrigued. I mean, how do we address this? What is the way to go in terms of trying to balance initiatives that are more inclusive and supportive of women, yet are not off-putting for other groups, and maybe they need to be. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's unclear exactly what the solution is. So from the survey study that I did, it seems like people in that study were the happiest with the programs offered by their company if their company offered both types of programs. So they had generic programs and targeted programs. But it seemed like the problem was when the company only had like primarily targeted programs, or if they only had the generic type. So it could be maybe there's you need to have a happy medium of offering all different types of programs. Maybe that's a potential solution, but I mean I don't know. There need to be more research done on that. Another possibility is that some of the studies I presented is just by making a small tweak. So instead of like labeling it as for women or for whoever, if you reframe the programs as being all-inclusive, still maintain the benefits and have all the same types of initiatives, but just don't necessarily frame it in an exclusive way, then maybe that might be an opportunity. And then also from that survey study, it was showing that people who think that racism and sexism no longer exist. We're the most resistant towards those targeted programs, so that might indicate an opportunity for education around those issues. Of course, it's easier said than done. I have another program of research trying to look at how best to educate people about bias in the workplace, and that can definitely be tricky. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of different types of solutions, but more research is needed. There's also some work being done by others looking at what they call like a all-inclusive type of multicultural ideology that is trying to be more inclusive of everybody so that you don't get those tensions in the workplace and some of the backlash against these programs.
Anybody else?
Bringing this because I'm worried I'll forget your name by the time I get over here. But Dr. Bowerband, I just had a quick question. As somebody that conducts surveys and tries really hard to give people kind of a safe space to respond, typically I've listed things like, these don't describe me well, and then giving a space for someone to describe them, or saying, I'd rather not say. But what sort of recommendations do you have for socially appropriate ways to gather this information that makes people feel welcome to respond to a survey?
It actually, I don't want to go to the caveat of it depends, but essentially my answer to that is you've got to have a quantitative way to include them in the survey. So offering them a prefer to self-describe works for a qualitative study where the numbers are small, but it's essential that they're counted in whatever approach. So in community surveys, which is to the far extreme, and I give lots of options, I tend to offer a caveat in the beginning, and that I understand some of these questions might not be easy to answer. You can select out of each one, but I ask the sex assigned at birth. I ask a current primary gender identity, so you get a one item that you can use and count. And then I offer them the option to prefer to self-describe as well, but asking them to kind of fit themselves into a category first. They tend to really like, and this is why I want to use this information more, is the rating scales of how much they identify with certain terms in a community sample. So giving them more, knowing you may or may not use that data, gives them a space, but also allows them to be counted in the survey. That obviously does not apply to a population survey, so my recommendation would be different than this.
Are there any additional questions? If not, let's thank the panel and all of today's speakers. Again, if you, I would suggest if you want to stay around and continue the discussion, please do so. Otherwise, thank you all for your participation, and safe drive home.